Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you for selecting my video. In today's video, we will be discussing how to strengthen a weak starter. This is a common problem among sourdough bakers where you have a sourdough starter that's working perfectly, you're baking great loaves, and then all of a sudden, due to seasonal changes in the type of flour that you're using, or sometimes for no apparent reason, your starter will just start to weaken over time. Now, as most of you know, having a strong starter is essential to baking great sourdough bread. So the question in everyone's mind is often, what do you mean by a strong starter? What does that mean? How do you measure the strength of a starter? The simple rule that I use is that a strong starter will typically double in height after a 1-1-1 feeding that's equal parts starter, flour, and water. It will double in height after a 1-1-1 feeding in roughly 4 hours. Here's an example of a video of my starter following a 1-1-1 feeding, and I also put a thermometer next to this so you can see the temperature, which is also important because it's ranging from 76 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 24.4 to 26.7 degrees Celsius. In that temperature range, the starter will very consistently double in height after a 1-1-1 feeding in 4 hours. That's my definition of a strong starter for purposes of this discussion. Now, different people maintain different types of starters, so let me tell you a little bit about mine for comparison. My starter follows the recipe recommended in the Tartine bread book for starter maintenance, which is basically a 50-50 mix of bread flour and whole wheat flour. I mix that with filtered tap water once a day, and I do a 1-1-1 feeding, which is equal parts existing starter, this 50-50 mix of bread flour and whole wheat flour, and filtered water. That gives you a specific consistency of your starter, and my starter will double in height as you saw in that video. Different consistencies of flour and different contents of your starter may or may not double in height. So we'll also talk in this video just about how to read your starter, how to listen to what your starter is telling you to see where it is in that process. Some people use all-purpose flour, which tends to provide a little bit thinner mix where you'll get a very bubbly starter, but it might not double in volume. Some people use rye flour, which is incredibly active, and that might triple or quadruple in volume in a 4-hour period. So different starters will behave differently. All I can do in this example is tell you what I'm using in mine, and we'll use that as the baseline for this discussion. Now, before we go any further, let me also clarify that this video is for people who already have a mature starter that has weakened and you're trying to figure out how to strengthen it. This video is not for people building a new starter. So if your starter is less than 14 days old, this video does not apply. And no matter how many times I say that, I'm sure the comments will be filled up with questions saying, I'm on day 3 of my starter, how do I strengthen it? This video won't give you the answer to that question. This is for mature existing starters that either have never come to full strength or they were strong in the past and they've weakened. So now when we talk about strengthening a starter, what are we actually trying to do? First, you have to understand what's in your starter. So there are 2 microbes in a sourdough starter culture. There's lactic acid bacteria and yeast. Those are the 2 types of microbes in the starter. For purposes of this discussion, and when we talk about strengthening a starter, most people refer to strengthening the yeast production, not the lactic acid bacteria. In a typical starter culture, the lactic acid bacteria will outnumber the yeast by a factor of 100 to 1. So people very rarely, in fact, I've never heard anybody say, oh, my starter is weak because I don't have enough lactic acid bacteria. That really isn't the problem when you talk about a weak starter. When people talk about a weak starter, they are always talking about the yeast production and the ability of the yeast to rise the dough. So for purposes of this discussion going forward, we're really talking about yeast strength and yeast production when we talk about strengthening the starter. So to understand how to strengthen your starter, you first need to understand what is the yeast actually doing. So the yeast is doing three things. One is it's eating starches and sugars in the flour, and it's creating carbon dioxide and creating a byproduct called ethanol, which is a type of alcohol. We are most interested in the creation of carbon dioxide because this is what helps the dough rise. This is the primary purpose of the yeast in a sourdough culture and a sourdough loaf, is the creation of carbon dioxide. That's the first function of the yeast. The second thing that the yeast is doing is that it's reproducing. So in order to maintain a strong starter culture, your yeast needs to vigorously reproduce so that it can sustain its population, because the third thing that the yeast is doing is it's dying. Yeast has a typical life cycle of about 2 weeks, so you can assume that every day you're losing about 1/14 of your yeast as it dies off. So you need your healthy yeast to be eating so that it can reproduce and replenish that population of yeast that's dying off. So now let's understand how a typical sourdough starter should behave. For purposes of this discussion, we'll talk about the daily feeding method. This is where you keep your sourdough starter at room temperature and you feed it once a day. Some people also do the refrigerator method, where they keep their starter in the refrigerator and they feed it once a week. We're not talking about that process here. I'm going to discuss the daily feeding approach where you're keeping your yeast at room temperature. So to fully understand what is happening with your sourdough starter, you need to really understand what I call the 7 stages of the starter feeding cycle, which are shown in this chart. So let's go through these step by step. Stage 1 is recently fed. When you've recently fed your starter, it's a thick consistency. In my example, I can turn my jar upside down and it will not pour out after I recently feed my starter, and it has no bubbles. Here's an example of stage 1, fairly thick consistency, no bubbles. Stage 2 is when your starter is rising. So after you've fed your starter, most people put a rubber band around their jar to show where they started, and then you will start to see the starter increase above the height of the rubber band. That's what I call stage 2, which is the rising stage. Here's an example of stage 2. You see the starter is rising and you start to see these air holes emerging on the top. Sometimes you'll see bubbles on the top as it's starting to push the height up. Stage 3 of the starter is very important to be able to identify, and that's when the starter has reached its peak. When the starter reaches its peak, it has stopped rising. If you watch it periodically, it will rise, 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 then it will pause. And when it pauses, if you look into your jar, you will actually see the starter domed up on the top. That's the last step of the peak, is when it domes. And that is the point where the starter is at its maximum population and maximum strength of production. Here's an example of stage 3 when the starter has peaked. You can see that it's domed on the top. You see these small air holes pushing through the top, and sometimes you will see bubbles on the top as well. Stage 4 is after the starter has peaked and domed at the top, it will start falling. Here's an example of stage 4 where you can see the starter is falling. It's starting to drop down from the point where it peaked, and you start to see more bubbles emerging on the top, and the starter begins to liquefy slightly. Stage 5 is when your starter has completely fallen. So the fallen stage is where it is back to the original rubber band line on your starter jar. Here's an example of stage 5 where you can see the starter has fallen back down to its original starting point. It's flat, it's starting to liquefy, and it's completely covered with bubbles. For stage 6, you cannot tell this just by looking at the outside of the jar. You need to look at the inside of the jar. Stage 6 is when your starter is hungry. When your starter is hungry, it's completely risen and fallen. The bubbles are subsiding, but it's flat, back to the original level, and it's more liquefied than it was when you started. So as I discussed, when we recently feed our starter, I can turn mine upside down and it will not pour out. When it gets to that hungry stage, it's started to liquefy because it's consumed most of the starches in the flour, and it will actually start to pour out of my jar in a much thinner than a batter consistency. It's very important to be able to identify the stage 6, where your starter is hungry, because this is one of the stages that we'll be discussing as we talk about how to strengthen a weak starter. Here's an example of stage 6, where you can see after the starter has fallen back to its original level, it will be covered completely with bubbles, but as it begins to get hungry and it's consumed all of the starches and sugars, the bubbles will start to subside because the starter is running out of food. So this is the first indication of a hungry starter, is fewer bubbles on that flat, liquefied surface. And stage 7, the last stage, is when your starter is starving. Once your starter has consumed all the starches and sugars in the flour and it starts to starve, it will start to develop a thin layer of ethanol or alcohol on top, which is called hooch. That is how you identify that your starter has completely consumed its food source and it is now starving. Here's an example of stage 7, where the starter is completely spent. It's consumed all of its food sources and it's starting to develop that layer of hooch on top, which is pure ethanol that indicates the starter has consumed all of the sugars in the flour. Those are the 7 stages of your starter. I'll be using those terms as we go forward to talk about how to strengthen your weak starter. So the 1-1-1 feeding ratio is a basic maintenance feeding. It's intended to keep your starter alive. It's as if your starter was in solitary confinement in prison. You're giving it one bologna sandwich each day just to keep it going. And the 1-1-1 ratio is somewhat arbitrary. So you really need to be able to read your starter and figure out, is your starter over consuming? Is it consuming all of the flour that you're feeding it each day, where in the last few hours between each feeding cycle, your starter might actually be starving and might be dying off? So maybe your specific starter needed to be a 1.1 feeding ratio, or a 1.3, 1.3. So 1-1-1 is arbitrary. It's in the ballpark. So the only way you can tell if a 1-1-1 feeding is appropriate for your starter is to look at these 7 stages that the starter goes through in its life cycle to see if you're giving it enough food to last 24 hours before the next feeding. If you're not, your starter can begin to weaken over time. Because if your starter doesn't have enough food to get to the next 24-hour feeding, in addition to the natural die-off of the yeast because of old age, you're also getting a die-off of some yeast because of starvation. And that's what you want to avoid, because that's what causes your starter to weaken over time. So now that we understand how the yeast behaves in a sourdough starter, let's talk about how do we strengthen the yeast in a weak starter. So the first thing you need to understand about strengthening your yeast is that the optimal temperature range that your yeast produces at is between 76 degrees Fahrenheit and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 24.4 degrees Celsius to 27.8 degrees Celsius. That's the sweet spot for production of the yeast. That is where it does its best work. So this is very important because some people will see changes in their sourdough starter culture based on seasonal changes. So your starter might be working perfectly during the summer, and then you get into fall and winter, and all of a sudden your yeast and your starter gets sluggish. It's because of the temperature change. So it's very important for your yeast to be in that sweet spot of the temperature range so that it can do its best work, both in terms of carbon dioxide production and its own reproduction. So here's what happens is you have your sourdough starter. Your yeast has showed up to do its job. Its job is to fill up 1 million balloons with carbon dioxide as it's rising the dough. The yeast is ready to go. And what happens is, instead of being in that perfect temperature range, your room temperature happens to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 21 degrees Celsius. That's cold for the yeast. That's like the yeast showed up to do its job. It's ready to fill up these 1 million balloons with CO2, and you put it outside in the middle of winter with no coat on. So the yeast isn't going to do its best work, even at a slightly lower temperature, like 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. Imagine that's like being outside in the winter without a coat on. So how do you get your yeast up to that perfect temperature? People find a spot in their house that maintains that optimal temperature. For me, it happens to be on top of my refrigerator in the winter. The refrigerator gives off a little bit of heat coming out of the top of it, maintains that perfect temperature. If I put it on my countertop, which is just a few degrees cooler, I don't get the same production out of my yeast. Some people use a proofing chamber. Some people put their starter inside of the oven with the light turned on. There are a lot of options, but what you need to do is you need to know what the temperature is for all those options. So I strongly recommend getting one of these small thermometers like this. And before you try something, like putting your yeast in the oven with the light on, test it and make sure you know what the temperature is. If I put my starter in the oven with the light on and I leave it in there all day, that temperature will get up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is too warm for the starter. It's outside of that optimal range. And once you get a temperature that's too warm, the yeast production actually will start to slow down, and it will favor the lactic acid bacteria production, which then consumes all of the starches and sugars because they're competing for the same resources as the yeast. You favor the lactic acid bacteria, and you basically starve off the yeast production at high temperatures. So you don't want it to be too warm. You don't want it to be too cold. You want it to be in that perfect temperature range. That's the easiest way to strengthen your starter, is to keep your yeast in its optimal production range as long as possible every day. The second way to strengthen a weak starter is to give it some additional nutrients. What a lot of people will do, and I do this occasionally, is instead of my normal 50-50 mix of bread flour and whole wheat flour, I will substitute a small portion of that with rye flour. This is whole grain rye, or with more whole grain wheat flour. So the whole grain flour is just to have more nutrients available in them for your starter, and sometimes just adding a small amount to your starter will give it a one-time boost that will boost your yeast population and production. By boosting that yeast population one time, you have a stronger population that you're then building off of in the future. So you don't want to, or you don't need to be doing that added whole grain every day. This is kind of a one-time adrenaline shot that you give your starter once a month, or if it seems like your starter is weakening. I would add, for example, in this case, 10 grams of rye flour. Instead of my total 50 grams of bread flour and whole wheat flour, I would do 40 of that mix, 10 grams of rye flour. You'll see an immediate reaction in your starter. It immediately perks up, it produces more vigorously, and what you really want is the yeast to be reproducing during that time so that you're starting with a larger population. Then some people would say, I don't want to add rye flour to my mix because I don't like the taste of rye bread, or I'm not making rye bread. If you watch my other video called the 5 feeding rule, you'll see that anytime you add something to your sourdough starter, if you do a 1-1-1 feeding with discard for 5 days in a row, after 5 days, less than 1% of that rye flour still exists in your starter. So this is a one-time thing that you do, then you go back to your normal feeding, and 5 days later, your 99.9% of the rye is gone. And the third way that I recommend you increase the strength of a weak starter is what I call peak-to-peak feeding. This is probably the most important and least discussed method of strengthening your starter. So what I mean by peak-to-peak feeding is you should do this over a weekend when you can monitor your starter continuously for about 2 days. And what you should do is essentially ignore the clock during this time and go back to the 7 stages of the starter that we talked about previously in this video. And what you want to do is give your starter a 1-1-1 feeding in the morning, and then monitor it very closely. And as soon as it reaches the peak, so that's when it's domed up on the top, maybe just starting to fall, you want to do another 1-1-1 feeding. This is what I call peak-to-peak feeding. Ignore the clock. It might take 4 hours. It might take 8 hours. It might take 12 hours. Resist the temptation to watch the clock and just watch the starter. So you feed it peak to peak. Every time it peaks, discard 2/3, refeed it 1-1-1 feeding, watch it again. As soon as it peaks again, discard 2/3, do the 1-1-1 feeding. That's what I call the peak to peak feeding. That will absolutely strengthen your starter over a couple of day period. Now, the only complication with this is that you need to sleep. So you can't feed your starter in the middle of the night if it's peaking in the middle of the night. This is why you really need to monitor it closely, and I recommend starting this in the morning because you can typically get 3 of these peak-to-peak feedings in, say, between 8 o'clock in the morning and when you go to bed at night. You don't need to get up in the middle of the night to do another feeding. What you want to do is just gauge where is your starter before you go to sleep. And let's say that I assume my starter is going to peak at 3 o'clock in the morning. Then when I do my last feeding before I go to sleep, I'm just going to give it a little extra flour and water so that it can make it through to the morning. But once you get good at really reading your starter, you'll be able to tell before you go to bed how much flour and water you want to feed it so that it has enough nutrition to last until you wake up in the morning. So now let's talk about the 3 most common mistakes people make when they're trying to strengthen their starter. So I participate in a lot of social media sourdough bakers groups. This question comes up all the time. My starter is weak. How do I strengthen my starter? And you'll hear 3 recommendations that I believe are mistakes. The first recommendation is what I would call overfeeding. So people say my starter is weak. How do I improve it? Somebody will say, that's easy. Instead of a 1-1-1 feeding, just give it a 1-2-2 feeding. So what happens when you do a 1-2-2 feeding? If your starter is weak and you have a 1-1-1 feeding routine, that means that it's not consuming all of the 1-1-1 feeding in the 24 hours since you fed it. So this is where you look at the 7 stages of your starter. The next morning, if you have a weak starter, it's not going to be that flat, bubbly, hoochie starter that we talked about at stage 7. There's still going to be unconsumed flour in your starter. That's the definition of a weak starter, is there's just not enough production and not enough population to consume all the flour that you fed it. So by saying go from a 1-1-1 feeding to a 1-2-2 feeding, that's like saying I fed you breakfast and you didn't eat the breakfast before the next day. So in order to strengthen you, I'm going to feed you breakfast and lunch. at the same time. You couldn't eat your breakfast in 24 hours. You're not going to eat breakfast and lunch in 24 hours. So just feeding a weak starter more does not strengthen the starter. And so I would argue that it's biologically impossible for a weak, small population of yeast to double its production of carbon dioxide just by doubling the amount of food that you're feeding it, because it can't eat one serving. It won't go faster and it won't grow faster and it won't reproduce by giving it 2 servings. So doubling your feeding ratio of a weak starter does not work. The second mistake people make when you're trying to strengthen a weak starter is that sometimes you'll be told you should increase the feeding frequency. Some people will recommend doing a 1-1-1 feeding every 12 hours. So what's happening here? If you have a weak starter and you're doing a 1-1-1 feeding every 24 hours and it's not consuming all the food in that time period, then cutting it off at 12 hours, discarding at least 2/3 of it, and then feeding a weak starter again after 12 hours does not improve the strength of your starter. What it does is it actually depletes the population of yeast, because when you do a 1-1-1 feeding, you're also discarding at least 2/3 of your starter. So this is a real common mistake that people make, is they're focused more on the feeding ratio and they forget about the discard. So when you have a weak starter and I discard more frequently, I'm weakening a weak population of my starter. That's the last thing you want to do, is discard more frequently when you have a weak starter. You want to give your starter time and the appropriate temperature to consume all of the flour that you fed it in the last feeding. You don't want to cut it off prematurely and discard 2/3 of the new yeast population that you just propagated. And the third mistake people make, and this is really bad, is they get impatient. They try all these different methods. They see that their starter still isn't improving. So they start to think, maybe I could sneak my little dime bag of commercial yeast and add a little commercial yeast to my starter, and maybe that would help. So you know how this goes. This is when you're in the kitchen and your significant other says, "What are you doing over there, honey?" And you're like, "Oh, nothing, just feeding my starter. Nothing to see here." This will ruin your starter. This is the last thing you want to do. Once you add commercial yeast to a wild sourdough yeast culture, it will completely take over. It will consume all the sugars and all the flour, and the wild yeast will die off. So resist the temptation always to add commercial yeast to your sourdough starter mix. This is like the science fiction movie where you're the scientist trying to protect the world and saying, maybe the aliens really aren't too bad. I think they're going to be friendly. And you invite the aliens into your sourdough starter. They're going to eat everything and kill the population. So don't do that. So just to recap the 3 ways to strengthen a weak starter. Number 1, get it in the right temperature zone. Number 2, give it a shot of some additional nutrients from time to time. And number 3, do peak-to-peak feeding over a weekend. Thanks for watching my video, and good luck with strengthening your weak starter.